Valley. I'd also just single out one other person, and everyone was really terrific, Steve Greenhouse, who was instrumental in helping us secure some of the plenary speakers and himself participated. I also particularly want to thank Emily Smith and Bernadette Tiemann, the staff of LERA. We could not make this happen without you. You've just been tireless and so easy to work with. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I know all of us do. I want to also reach out to Adrienne Eaton. We'll hear from her obviously during this meeting, for your steadfastness and contributions during this very difficult year, and also the members of the executive board of LERA and all the committees. Thank you so much for your contributions to this very unique organization, and this special forum where so many of us from different perspectives, academic, practitioner, labor management, government, advocate, neutral, et cetera, come together and can have a conversation about these important issues. I might just throw in quickly that one member of the executive board is recently nominated last week to be wage and hour administrator at the Labor Department, and that's David Weil. He'll be hopefully soon going back to fill the position that he held in the Obama administration. I think if we were all together in one room together, I would ask all of the past LERA presidents who were present to stand up and let us applaud you. But I would just suggest that if you're a past LERA president, and I'm looking at one, but I can't see all of you, to maybe raise, either put a comment in the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom so we can acknowledge you. I also would like to acknowledge the passing of two LERA past presidents during 2021. One is Marlene Heiser, who was president of LERA in 2004. She was the director of labor relations at the Orange County Transportation Authority. She negotiated with all the unions at the Transportation Authority and was one of the few women to hold this position of authority in the transportation industry in the United States. So we acknowledge her role, and I'm sorry of her passing. In addition, we lost George Schultz. He died shortly after his 100th birthday, as I'm sure everyone knows. Well, first of all, he was president of LERA in 1968. Sure, everyone knows he was an American economist, diplomat, and businessman. He served 3 different Republican presidents and held 4 different cabinet level posts, most unusual. Labor, the Office of Management and Budget, Treasury, and State. George Schultz often stated that his labor relations background trained him well for negotiating with international adversaries. So we remember both George Schultz and Marlene Heiser and their contributions, not only to LERA, but in general to this field. LERA President Adrienne Eaton, who will be our featured speaker this afternoon. I'll have more to say about her in a little while, but I'm going to turn the program over to her to introduce our Lifetime Achievement Award winners for 2021.
Thank you, Wilma. So we have 3 Lifetime Achievement Award winners today, Dennis Dabney, Chris Rondo, and Paula Voos, and I'm going to very briefly introduce each, and then I think they are each going to speak, perhaps pre-recorded. I'm not quite sure about that, but Bernadette and Emily will handle that. So first up, Dennis Dabney. So many of you will know Dennis recently retired as the Senior Vice President for National Labor Relations for Kaiser Foundation's Hospital and Health Plans, the proper name of his organization. Prior to joining Kaiser, Dennis was Vice President of HR at First Energy, Director of Human and Labor Relations at DTT Energy, and also worked at ThyssenKrupp Bud. So what did Dennis do in these jobs that earned him this award? And here I want to thank Tom Koken for helping me think about this and put this together. So one, Dennis was one of our the early pioneers in using interest-based bargaining at DT Energy, and then helped to teach others about its strengths and limitations in the MIT Harvard Negotiation Training Program. He maintained support from the top executives at Kaiser Permanente for the labor management partnership through its most difficult years, especially recently when the union coalition split into the alliance and the coalition subgroups. He served as an inspiration, role model, and mentor to women and minority middle and upper level managers at Kaiser Permanente and helped to develop a number of them to move up to top leadership positions, both inside and outside KP. And he advanced the role and sang the praises of the unit-based teams at Kaiser Permanente as the heart and soul of the labor management partnership. He was quick to see their potential and their key role in making the partnership real to frontline workers and especially to the all-powerful, at least in their own minds, physicians. And the Permanente Medical Group. More than anything else, the UBTs are a lasting legacy of his time at Kaiser Permanente and indeed of the labor management partnership. And of course, when it comes to LERA, Dennis served as LERA president last year and has been a longtime supporter of LERA's, including serving as a presenter and helping to facilitate Kaiser Permanente's financial support for the organization. Here's Dennis.
Thanks, Adrienne, and to everyone at LERA for this thoughtful recognition and for all the friendship and camaraderie over the years. I've come a long way since I was placed into my first human resources job when I was a much younger man working at a large automotive parts manufacturing plant on the east side of Detroit. My career in human resources led me from the automotive industry to the energy sector, and for the past 10 years into healthcare, where I led labor relations for Kaiser Permanente. I've learned a lot at each stop. Throughout my career journey, I found LERA to be an invaluable resource in helping me to meet thought leaders, test ideals, and to learn the latest industry standards from some of the best in the business. I also made a lot of friends. I would like to thank all of you individually by name, but there are so many of you who have helped me over the years that doing so would take all day. Suffice it to say, my association with LERA and with all of you has always provided me with an extra edge in my career and with an endless source of fun stories and good times. I wish each of you continued success in helping organizations succeed and employees to find fulfillment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. And if we were in person, there would be loads of clapping going on. So I'm going to do my virtual clapping.
Thank you.
So next is Chris Rondo. Chris is the director of the New England Organizing Project, which is affiliated with AFSCME. She's been a union organizer and contract negotiator for over 4 decades. She was one of the founders and organizers of the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers, about which much has been written. Members of her team went on to organize SHARE, the union at UMass Memorial Medical Center and UMass Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts, a group that I've had the privilege to study and work with. The UMass Drive was the largest successful union campaign in central Massachusetts in the last 60 years when it happened. Over the years, Chris and her team have organized 30,000 workers, mostly women, in the service sector industries of healthcare and higher education. I think I first met Chris at Rutgers when she came to give a talk, and where, if my memory serves me right, she took out a metaphorical purple crayon and talked about what unions might look like and do if we started over. Well, some of the audience grumbled that her approach wasn't realistic. I found it inspiring and have continued to be inspired by and learn from Chris ever since. Those of you who know Chris know that the essence of her approach to organizing and doing work is around creating relationships and building community, what is sometimes called a high touch model, where kindness is a fundamental value. Strange for labor relations, right? Chris's bio, from which I borrowed to write this introduction, says that Chris has long been interested in non-traditional labor management negotiating styles, everyday negotiating, alternative dispute resolution, workplace flexibility, and continuous adult learning. But I would say that Chris isn't merely interested in those things, but rather they are at the center of the labor management relations and collective agreements she has been involved in. Finally, she and her organizations have long been strong supporters of LERA, presenting and otherwise participating in our meetings in a lot of different ways. And of course, she served as LERA president in 2019. Take it away, Chris.
Chris,
Thank
you unmuted and then muted yourself again.
Now I'm there. Now I'm here.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for this. It's really lovely to be recognized by an organization that I love so much. And like Dennis, I would say over the years, over many years, LERA and its members and activists have been the people that I turn to work out dilemmas, both big and small, in practical life. So it's a wonderful place, of course, to learn about ideas, but also to be surrounded by practical people who are interested in a different vision of how we could create a labor movement. So I want to thank everybody very much for that and for being that. And I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Chris. And again, I'm going to do my virtual clapping. Well deserved. So next, Paula Voos. Paula earned her PhD in economics from Harvard in 1982, working with, among others, John Dunlop. As you can imagine, of a woman earning that degree in that place at that time, she has some interesting stories to tell. Paula's first published work estimated the costs and benefits of union organizing programs from the perspective of unions' current members. Paula has done innovative research on labor management cooperation, edited an important book with Larry Michelle on unions and economic competitiveness, and has led a series of innovative studies on the stock market effects of labor and employment legislation. Working with me and a team of current and former PhD students, Paula has conducted research on graduate student unionization. She co-authored a letter brief to the NLRB on this topic and has testified in a board hearing in the NYU case using our research. Paula has engaged in lots of important public service in our field, including as a member of the Dunlop Commission in 1994, a public member of the Ford UAW VEBA, the Voluntary Employee Benefits Association, in the mid-2000s. She has served for several years as a public member of the New Jersey Public Employment Relations Commission, something she continues to do despite a professed hatred of legal reasoning. Paula has taught hundreds, probably thousands of students between her time at Wisconsin and Rutgers, and has been an innovator in providing access to non-traditional students and in developing online programs long before the pandemic. I first met Paula as a student in her IR theory class during my very first semester in the PhD program at Wisconsin. Coming to LERA, Paula served as editor-in-chief for IRRA, our precursor name, from 1994 to 2002, edited the 1994 research volume, Contemporary Collective Bargaining in the US, and served as president in 2003, only the fifth woman in that role, as best as I can tell. She was made a LERA Fellow in 2018. Take it away, Paula.
Thank you for that really wonderful introduction, Adrienne. I really appreciate it. And as far as LERA goes, I am old enough that when it was the IRRA and centered at the University of Wisconsin, I was fortunate to realize how important as an assistant professor it could be to my career. And I really feel like this organization has helped me do research and meet other researchers and get my ideas out there in the world. And it's been just the most important organization. And if anyone here is new, I feel like many of us have been here for many years, but if anyone here is new, obviously participating in each and every LERA national session is important. And I'd also like to say that I'm very fortunate that the semester where Adrienne was a first semester graduate student was the first semester where I taught IR theory at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm very pleased that I'm still working with her on the core interest of mine in labor organization and what we can do to be sure that more people in the United States really have the chance to organize, which is still a very difficult and problematic thing, as everyone knows. I'd also like to say that most of my co-authors, many of them are here: Dale Bellman, besides Adrienne, Larry Michelle, Sean Rogers, Steve Abraham, many of the people that I've worked with over the years, Haejin Kim, Dongwon Kim, have been invaluable. Most of my work has not been alone, and I'm grateful for all my co-authors as well as the organization. So thank you very much.
So my congratulations to Dennis, Paula, and Chris. Thank you for your remarkable lifetime achievements and continuing to contribute to this field and be a part of this organization. Before I introduce Adrienne, the president, I just wanted to say I neglected before when I thank people to extend a thanks, really a heartfelt thanks, to all of the participants in this meeting, and particularly to all of the people who participated as speakers, who organized sessions, who spoke at sessions. I think we had a wonderful group of people, including some people new to LERA. So I thank all of you, and I encourage all of you, particularly the new people, to stay involved. So at this point, it is my pleasure. I am really delighted to introduce Adrienne Eaton, the current president of the Labor and Employment Relations Association. As I said at yesterday's general membership meeting, she's going to go into LERA history as its first wholly virtual president, and hopefully its last. So congratulations for that. Thank you. Adrienne, as everyone knows, is the Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. She also serves as a member of the New Jersey Governor Murphy's Task Force on the Future of Work. 10 years ago, she served as a member of the New Jersey Public Employee Relations Commission. She holds a PhD in industrial relations from the University of Wisconsin, as we sort of just learned. Adrienne continues to be a very active researcher in a wide number of areas. In 2017, she was named a LERA Fellow in recognition of her research. I don't recall exactly how we first met Adrienne, but it likely was at LERA meetings. Years ago by now. Some of her research was of particular interest to me during my tenure as a member of the National Labor Relations Board, including her published research on the unionization of graduate student employees, which has been cited in NLRB cases, and her groundbreaking research on the negotiation and outcomes of neutrality and card check agreements, which has been published in several publications and cited in congressional floor debates. Her most recent edited book is Informal Workers and Collective Action, A Global Perspective, which was published in 2017 and co-edited with Sue Sherman and Martha Chen. Adrienne continues her research on labor management partnerships, particularly in healthcare. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on this topic. And in 2009, she published, along with co-authors Tom Koken, Paul Adler, and Robert McCursey, the book Healing Together, the Kaiser Permanente Labor Management Partnership. Like so many of Adrienne's students and professional colleagues, I have enjoyed and learned from many discussions with Adrienne, especially about informal workers and the gig economy. I very much valued working with her on a few of Rutgers' forward-looking projects and conferences on worker ownership, crowdsourcing and crowd workers, and more broadly, digital transformation and work. And I'm going to conclude as I did at the general membership meeting, but I think we have a broader audience. I'm going to quote Sue Sherman, a friend and close colleague of Adrienne's, her predecessor as Rutgers Dean. As Sue wrote, and I have to give her credit because she's here, so I can't just borrow without attribution. Adrienne's career and contributions represent the essence of what LERA is all about and what the field of labor and industrial and employee relations is all about. In addition to being a first-rate scholar, she has been president of one of the largest faculty unions in the country, the Rutgers AAUP-AFT union, the Union of Faculty and Grad Students. She's been a department chair. She's now dean. She has served on outside neutral bodies. She is, in short, the epitome of what John R. Commons called the triple threat professor, scholar, teacher, and practitioner. Adrienne.
Thank you, Wilma, for that introduction. I've been thinking about this talk for a long time and struggling with what to say in this moment and given the events of the last year. I had originally been thinking I would focus this talk on democracy, and I spent some time reading the works of various political scientists and philosophers on the linkages between political and economic democracy, something I've long been interested in. But as I shifted my reading in some new areas and thought more about all the events of the past year, I headed in a different direction. I started with the idea that we, as members of the LERA community, as professionals in the field of employment relations, and as human beings, are facing numerous crises. I was inspired in part to think about multiple crises by the introduction to the 2021 LERA research volume, Revaluing Workers Toward a Democratic and Sustainable Future, which was written by my Rutgers colleagues Toby Schultz-Clevin and Todd Vachon. First and foremost in our minds, the thing that continues to keep us apart for this conference is the pandemic. The pandemic has upended work, the institution of central concern that LERA revolves around. With the shutdowns in March of 2020, the pandemic crisis quickly became an employment and work crisis. As I said to a student newspaper reporter around that time, people were either working from home, many of whom had never done so before, working unsafely, or not working. And many of those who were not working, and maybe are still not working, were or are wondering about where their next meal was going to come from. I think here especially of the undocumented among us, who have little or no access to the social safety net. Here are some quotes from undocumented workers in New York City, most from the spring of 2020. Well, in the case of my family, we are very scared because we had the loss of my brother who died from the coronavirus, and everyone is scared by this pandemic that we have had to live in isolation, without work, without money, and with great fear. It is impacting us financially, emotionally. There is sadness, worry, fear, and anguish among my children because of the fact that we, their parents, could die. We, as parents, we are concerned about financial insecurity and not knowing when we will return to work. I'm worried because my dad lost his job and my mom is the only one working. She's working at a laundromat. She's risking her health to work, and I'm scared my parents will get sick because they are also undocumented. There were days I couldn't sleep, to be honest with you. We had nothing. Returning now to my own voice. Under the former administration, OSHA refused to do anything about workplace safety, though some states did, including my own. The federal government expanded the definition of eligibility for unemployment insurance and increased the payments. But many states, either purposefully or a result of poor IT systems or both, had enormous troubles implementing these changes. Healthcare workers improvised protective equipment and new clinical spaces. Many worked unsafely and some died. 3,600 in the US alone, according to estimates by the Kaiser Health News and The Guardian. All these topics and more have provided challenges and lessons in the world of practice and a rich world to study for those of us who do research, however ghoulish that might sound. And research is already emerging from those with the time and energy to do it. Perhaps this entire talk should be dedicated to work and the pandemic, but I thought maybe we might all be a bit tired of it, honestly. So then there is climate change, an existential threat to us all, and one that is demonstrated in last year's conference. A theme around sustainability touches many areas in which we work, from green jobs to just transitions to immigration and immigrant workers and beyond. It's a hard topic to center in the day-to-day work that many of us do, and yet it looms over everything. As an aside, I want to mention my favorite quote that links climate change and the world of labor and employment relations. I first heard it from Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. But in Googling around, I learned that someone named Judy Bonds is often credited with saying it first. Judy was a coal miner's daughter and an environmental activist in West Virginia, which can help you imagine the context for that quote. She died of cancer in 2011. The quote is, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." And by the way, I've also seen the quote adapted to, "There is no business on a dead planet." And I suppose we could say there are no publications and no tenure on a dead planet either. Our field needs to grow in its engagement with this crisis, no matter the particular work we each do. Then there are the interrelated crises of inequality, racism, and democracy. The impact of both the pandemic and climate change have been and will continue to be felt unequally and have exacerbated inequalities of multiple kinds, both within the US and globally, as we can see now with the vaccine rollout. I believe our field has been centrally concerned with some kinds of inequality since its founding. The inequality of power between workers and capital, or managers if you prefer, what we might call class inequality. I think we've been less focused on racial inequality, and we've been called to task for that by my colleague Tammy Lee and her co-author Maita Tapia, among others. I strongly urge you to read their paper, Confronting Race and Other Social Identity Erasures, The Case for Critical Industrial Relations Theory, in the May 2021 special issue on Theory in Industrial and Labor Relations Review. It may raise more questions for you than give answers, but that's a good thing, especially for the field. I'm not sure I agree with everything that Tammy and Maita say in their paper, and I don't think I completely understand all of it, but I know we need to absorb the argument, sit with it, think about what it means for our own work, whether that work is research and teaching or practice in the field. I'm proud that the 2022 LERA research volume is being edited by Maita and Tammy, along with two other Rutgers faculty members, Naomi Williams and Cherie Davis. The title of that volume is Industrial Relations and a Racial Reckoning, and I look forward to seeing it. Personally, I am very drawn to the argument that we actually cannot and should not separate race and class. I've been very interested in the work of Ian Haney-Lopez in this regard and have been trying to find time to read his book, Merge Left. Haney-Lopez is a law professor at UC Berkeley, where he studies and writes on politics. He's the author of a book on racial dog whistles. I'm going to assume you know what those are. The subtitle of his newer book is Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. Who doesn't want to win elections and save America? I highly recommend the book, which, of interest to this audience, starts with the story of a visit he paid to an annual retreat of a national union's leadership in Florida. It's an interesting story. He argues that racism is fundamentally a class weapon, one used by moneyed interests to misdirect white working class people about who or what is to blame for the rampant inequality they are experiencing, along with working class people of color. In a way, this message isn't terribly new. But, and I confess here that I'm not that deep into the book yet. In this case, it's rooted in a lot of polling and survey research, and Haney Lopez is all about using his findings to produce better political and organizing messaging. Turning to inequality and its relationship to threats to democracy, I was also inspired by reading Kathy Thalen's presidential address to the American Political Science Association, titled The American Precariat, U.S. Capitalism and Comparative Perspective, and published in 2019. It is quite interesting, though not surprising for those of us who know Professor Thalen's work, that her talk is really centered on topics that we focus on at LERA, what she labels atypical employment, and some of us would prefer to call informal employment or even precarious employment. She shows a series of graphs and charts. Some of her graphs are focused just within the United States, showing the nature of class inequality. Here's one example. It shows access to paid sick leave, and I picked it in part because this became such a huge issue during the pandemic. The left side shows the decline over time by different occupation groups, with the lowest access always for production workers, and the steep decline among technical and clerical workers. The chart on the right is access by income quartile, which is pretty self-explanatory. The other set of charts in the piece show a series of comparisons between Europe and the US, mostly relying on OECD data. Let me show you a couple of those, although again, I'm sure these will not be shocking to many of you. I can say that these kinds of comparisons are often shocking to Rutgers students. The first shows statutory paid time off, both for vacations and holidays. The US is over there on the right with 0. The second is not from Thalen's talk. I found this in an article in the magazine Fast Company. Yeah, we're over there on the right again, mostly red, meaning least generous, unemployment insurance, parental entitlements, annual leave and holidays, and sick pay. Again, these benefits rose in importance during the pandemic and continue to be so. For instance, in a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll on vaccine hesitancy, 21% of unvaccinated workers said they'd be more likely to get the vaccine if their employer provided paid time off to both get the vaccine and recover from any side effects. I also want to mention here a recent MBER study summarized in May 28th story in the New York Times. This study shows how women's labor force participation fell compared to men's in 18 out of 28 countries in North America and Europe, with the greatest gaps in the US and Canada. These gaps were a function of school closures, which were longest in the US and Canada, lack of a robust childcare system, but also gaps in other labor market policies like the use of furloughs and the differential impact of telecommuting on work at home. I'm not going to speak to gender again in this talk, but I want to highlight here how important a gendered lens can be to our research, as demonstrated in this paper, which contrasts what the authors call the pandemic-induced she session versus earlier man sessions, and the differing policy implications of these different events. I also want to note that the issues facing women workers discussed in this paper are pervasive in higher education, creating inequities that are frankly without good answers, or at least ones that most of our institutions can easily afford. Back now to my charts, or rather Thalen's charts. The third chart is again from Thalen's paper. It presents union density and coverage, a perennial favorite for us. The data are a little old, but I don't think anything has changed fundamentally. The US is over there close to the edge again, although this time it's the left edge. Only close because our union density is actually higher than France's. Union coverage, of course, tells a different story. Thalen sums up, quote, "All the rich democracies are experiencing a shared problem of growing contingency and precarity. However, it seems fair to say that the problem of precarity presents itself with special intensity in the United States," end quote. She also links political democracy to economic democracy and the need for political science as a discipline to study macro-political economy and not just voting behavior and individual attitudes. Thalen's concern with democracy brings me to another presidential address, that of Paula Voos to LERA, well, actually IRRA, in 2003. Paula's address was on democracy and industrial relations. Her first sentence reads, "Political democracy is thriving in the world." Things seem to have changed. To be fair, she goes on to say that, quote, "Democracy may be doing well in the world, but is not doing well in the United States," end quote, citing low rates of voting and particularly lower rates for those with lower incomes. Both Voos and Thalen argue that income and wealth inequality constitute threats to democracy, with Voos emphasizing the ways unions can strengthen democracy, not just by encouraging voting, but also through reducing inequality. Schulz-Clevin and Vachon's introduction also discusses the links between precarity and status anxiety and openness to right-wing populism. As does Guy Standing in the very title of his well-known book, The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. My point here is that the concerns of our field, focused on employment, have important implications for the crisis of democracy. As Thalen calls for political science to consider macro-political economy and the institutions of employment, perhaps our field needs to spend more time considering the implications of work and employment on political institutions and politics. Returning to Thalen's address, she also argues cause and effect, saying, "Unions have been the key protagonist in expanding social protections and reducing inequality." Further, quote, "One of the most robust findings in the literature on comparative political economy is that the strength of the organized labor movement is associated with lower inequality, especially low-end inequality, and more generous social protections," end quote. Voos points to lower voting rates among those with lower incomes as another explanation for our poor social safety net and labor laws. But I wonder whether there isn't a different cause of poor social protections in the United States and low unionization rates. And this brings me back to our racial reckoning and to the second book I want to talk about. This book is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, who happens to be an Ian Haney Lopez student. Where do I even start with this searing and necessary book? McGee's central argument is that we are all harmed by white racism, and especially by the related zero-sum notion held by many white people that if people of color, especially Black people, have more of something, that means they have less. According to McGhee, the zero sum is a story sold by wealthy interests for their own profit, and its persistence requires people desperate enough to buy it. Further, she argues, quote, "The narrative that white people should see the well-being of people of color as a threat to their own is one of the most powerful subterranean stories in America. Until we destroy the idea, opponents of progress can always unearth it and use it to block any collective action that benefits us all," end quote. The book walks us through the history of the zero-sum lie. I'm going to call it a lie in the spirit of the book. Starting with a look at the period of 1680s and early 1700s, which she calls a deliberate effort to legislate a new hierarchy between poor whites and unwhite natives and African laborers. McGhee points out, like Thalen, differences between the US and Europe. Quote, "When it comes to per capita government spending, the US is near the bottom of the list of industrial countries, below Latvia and Estonia. With the exception of about 40 years from the New Deal to the 1970s, the US has had a weaker commitment to public goods and to the public good than every country that possesses anywhere near our wealth," end of quote. She talks about how the public goods of the so-called Golden Age in the United States, starting with the New Deal itself, including unions and the NLRA, moving through the implementation of the GI Bill, if not its design, to the investment in highways that made suburbs possible, These were all predicated on segregated access to these goods. She tells the story of public swimming pools, and this story, told on a radio broadcast or podcast, was my original introduction to this book. She starts with the glory years of pool building starting in the 1920s, leading eventually to the fight to desegregate public pools. But with desegregation, many public pools were actually privatized or heartbreakingly filled in. And the point of the pool story is that now no one who needed a public pool, including poor and working class whites, got to have a pool anymore. The idea that race is at the core of why the U.S. has fewer public goods, less of a social safety net, fewer protective labor laws, and a lower rate of collective bargaining is not new to me, but McGee has done an important job in systematically documenting it. It is something our field needs to grapple with, whether through a critical race theory lens, as Lee and Tapia have argued, or some other theoretical perspective. I've long been a big fan of the Sandy Jacoby book chapter in his 1991 edited book, Master to Managers. The chapter is titled American Exceptionalism Revisited: The Importance of Management. It seems high time for someone to write a new piece with the title American Exceptionalism Revisited: The Importance of Race. I have meandered on long enough. I will simply conclude by repeating that our world is facing multiple interrelated crises. Our field can be at the center of responding to these multiple crises through our research, teaching, service, and practice. Indeed, it must be to survive and prosper. More importantly, these crises must be faced if we are to survive and prosper as human beings. But we need to be intentional about it, and we need to expand the range of voices we hear, including those of the workers we study, advocate for, and manage, including those who are most marginalized, like the workers I quote at the beginning of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne, so much for such an incredibly thoughtful talk. You demonstrated, first of all, what Sue Sherman said in bringing together really sophisticated intellectual research in teaching. It was a wonderful teaching piece, and in grappling with the real world challenges, the interlocking crises that we've experienced over the last, not only the last year and a half, but the last few decades. So thank you so much for that. I think we're a little early, and so I am going to extemporize here just a little bit. I was told that at the end of your talk, I should announce that we have 5 interesting breakout sessions that are going to follow and 1 meeting, and I'll quickly do that, but that's not my extemporizing. So at 3 o'clock, we will have a session on teaching, employment relations, and collective bargaining in higher ed. Another on labor market opportunity and economic security for Native Americans. Another on labor studies and the future of workers. One on impacts of COVID-19 on app-based work and worker organization, and a LERA best papers, nature of work, part A. And then there's a junior faculty consortium meeting that will take place from 3 to 5:15. So here's how I'm going to extemporize. I am going to, and I hope Emily and Bernadette don't tell me I'm overstepping my role here, but I'm going to invite the former presidents who are in the audience if they want to comment or ask Adrienne any questions. I think we'd have probably enough time for at least 2 of you. So anyone want to step up? I'll start with former presidents.
So this is Joel.
Hey, Joel.
I'm happy to this is partly a question, but partly just a note of appreciation. I really appreciate the way you've lifted up racial equity in particular, and and marginalized communities more broadly in our economy in your address. And I know this is a hard thing to ask, but if you were to imagine 5 years from now that LERA made great progress in the spirit of your presidential address, in your mind, what would success look like?
Joel, you always ask the hard questions. Sometimes they're fun to answer and sometimes not so much. Well, one thing I just want to say is, as I've been listening to the sessions leading up to this one, so many of the themes that I talked about in the talk, which was recorded, a week ago, have been present in the theme of the meetings. And so, I was thinking particularly about Wilma's session earlier on democracy, based on a book, an edited volume, I think. So we're already doing a lot of it. I think the tough part and the irony, right, is the worker voice part of it. And I think, I've listened to some of my colleagues who've really been pushing on that, thinking themselves more about participant action research that brings workers or their organizations, into conversation about research itself. And it's partly a resource issue, but I also think it's a kind of cultural issue. We had a conversation about this, Joel, right, with Erin Johansson about how to bring more folks from worker centers. And so some of that's about money, but some of it's also about creating a comfortable space where they feel welcomed, and are getting something valuable from the organization. So I think there's work to be done on all of that. And that's where I'll stop.
No, I really appreciate that. In a sense, we could all take on the task of late LERA being a safe, or even what people call a brave space.
And Joel, I'll say, you've put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. So the Gershenfeld Fund, of course, is now available to fund folks from low resource organizations and more diverse voices to come to the meeting. And we're also now tacking a little extra charge onto registration fees to make that possible as well. So that's a starting point. That's the resource piece.
Thank you, Joel, for stepping up. Is there another past president who has the courage to do that? Doesn't have to be a complicated question. I know you're out there. So let me just ask, how optimistic?
I don't know if you.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if you can. This is Tom. I'm driving, so I don't know if you can hear me or not. But
we can hear you.
First of all, I really appreciated your comments. Your talk, Adrienne, is from the heart and from the mind, and that's really, really important to our organization. I hope that as we look forward, that we will empower more of the diverse and young people who I see listed on the program, I've seen in the various sessions, to take charge of the organization. We have been too old for too long, and I will take personal responsibility for being in that club. But I see the organization getting younger, more diverse, more vibrant every year. And I just want to continue, hope that we continue that. And maybe we institutionalize it in ways that help the young people in the PhD consortium and the junior faculty consortium to take charge of more of the program. I think that will strengthen us. I think that will keep us all younger for longer. And I think more young people in their careers will benefit from that exposure as well. So I really like the program that we are enjoying this year. Adrienne, your speech was right on target for the times we are in, and let's just keep going forward.
Thank you, Tom. Can I just comment, Wilma? You're muted and I'm not, so I'm going to take that privilege. But I feel like some of that, what you're saying, Tom, is important, and it means some of us need to step back too. And I've been trying to think about that in the later stages of my career. I'm not sure that I'm implementing it or executing it appropriately yet, but I think it's on all of us older folks to step back also.
I'd like to make a comment about that and follow up on Tom, because I will be candid that when I was asked whether I would agree to run for president, I spoke to Tom and Harry Katz, and I said one of my worries was when I looked down the list of former presidents and the years they served, that I was going to be the oldest standing president in LERA's history. And Tom and Harry Katz assured me that that was okay, because there would be a lot of young people who would participate on panels. And so I want to really reiterate what Tom and Adrienne have just said. We really need everybody, the more senior people and the newer people, because I think these are challenging times and they call for a wide range of ideas to keep the organization vital and to answer the challenges that we face. So thank you, Tom. We have time for one more former president.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, it's David Lewin. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I too thought that Adrienne's remarks were right on, and if I may say so, very lofty. I don't want to repeat what Joel and Tom have rightly said, in my opinion, but I would like to say one thing to those who are attending this presidential address. I joined the LERA as a first-year PhD student in 1967. And through the years and decades, I have found it to be the single most valuable professional organization that I'm affiliated or involved with. And beyond that, the personal relationships with so many colleagues that I was able to develop through the LERA meetings and the LERA activities are one of the single most important things in my career and my life. So it's testimony to the LERA, and I simply wanted to say that on the record.
Thank you, David. Anyone else before I ask my last question to Adrienne? So hearing no one else, Adrienne, do you leave this moment optimistic about the future of our country? Or are you kind of overwhelmed by the various challenges?
I think I'm an optimist by nature. At least I perceive myself in that way. I know I'm not always perceived in that way by people who know me, but honestly, I'm not terribly optimistic about the immediate future. And I know, I think, Wilma, that you feel that way as well. We most of us have looked away from January 6th to keep on going. But I just think it's a profound moment that's going to repeat itself, honestly. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
but young people do give me hope, that's for sure, including my son, my adult son, who's living in the house with me and who's very vocal about his opinions about the world every day. So that keeps me somewhat energized.
Yeah. Well, hope springs eternal. So again, Adrienne, let me thank you so much for these really inspiring remarks. You got us all thinking, really intellectually rich and so timely and topical. And thank you for your past year's service to LERA. I hope you're not stepping aside. For young or old, you got to stay involved. And I thank all of you for participating in this sort of ersatz luncheon address, and hope to see you all in the remaining sessions and next year in Detroit. Thank you again to Emily and Bernadette.